I'm very, very excited to introduce the next paper. I will say that when the Seattle Times contacted us, they wanted to know a lot more about this paper in particular, in conjunction with the Spot demo, and indeed it is a very informative and enriching paper. I'll start as I have been with our discussant. So Peter Asaro, I am very glad to say, has agreed to be the discussant for this paper. This is an especially good fit. People know that Peter is at the New School and one of the pioneers of robot ethics and robot law, and has written about a wide variety of intersections between robotics and intimacy, robotics and war, and also very specifically the use of robotics in policing and some of the societal, racial, and other dynamics that emerges from that. So he's a really absolutely perfect discussant for this, and so I'm really happy that you can do it. And also, of course, an absolute staple of this conference and at the heart of it. And then we have two, I believe, new participants. Neither of you have been to this conference before. Carolyn Kemper and Michael Collane. Apologies if I'm getting the pronunciation wrong, but they're both from the German Research Institute for Public Administration. Gosh, which I'd like to know a little bit more about that organization as well. Yeah, so please join me in welcoming our panel. Thank you very much. Take it away.
Thank you, Ryan. And thank you for this paper. I think this is a very timely sort of paper to be talking about, especially even after the discussion we had right before lunch. I think it's kind of important to keep in mind also the different kinds of racial dynamics around policing and robots in the States versus Germany. And I'm also sort of hearing voices from Ian Kerr and Michael Frumkin saying, okay, so why is this about robots, or why does it need to be robots? And why does this need to be a canine, and things like that? So I think those sort of themes are kind of in the background of how I read all of this. But I'm going to try to present what I think are the really fruitful and fertile ideas that are sort of all over this paper. It's kind of like going through a hallway and you peer into a door and there's all these great questions, and then they close the door and you go down and you open another door. There's all these great questions and then they close it. And that's my experience of reading your paper. So I think you could make a lot of papers out of this. But it starts, I think, really raising interesting questions around surveillance and privacy, which apply to all sorts of robots in public spaces, and particularly what that means when you have state control of robots in the policing context. And they make some effort to try to grapple with the GDPR and the law enforcement directives around the GDPR and how that might apply to the kinds of data that these robots might collect, which I'm not a GDPR expert, but there seems to be built into it a sort of law enforcement exemption, right? That's mostly focused on corporations or the processors and collectors of data, and then the rights of citizens and individuals to sort of access or know about this data collection. But there's these exemptions for law enforcement, but there are also specific rules around state collection of data and transfer between states, I think in Article 48 of the GDPR. So I think you could probably just write a whole paper about that, but way outside of my depth. But thinking very more practically about what kind of data these systems are collecting, and how that becomes harm, whether that's an immediate harm of an intervention that a robot might have with a citizen, or whether that could be a long-term harm of how we transform a public space that might be being patrolled by a robot into a not so public space because you're under surveillance, and that can have chilling effects. And that can also affect specific communities, and it matters a lot where these systems are deployed and whose communities those are, how that affects not just individuals, but those communities and the public spaces themselves. In the US context, this gets into freedoms of association, freedoms of assembly, and things like that. And are you really free if you're constantly being surveilled, or if it has those chilling effects of practice? And data privacy in the US, of course, also works very differently than it does under GDPR. So if we start thinking about that and First Amendment and the rights to not illegal search and seizure protections and things like that, we really, the federal law is more focused on preventing the state from collecting data on individuals, where corporations are allowed to collect all this data on individuals. Although we've seen a lot of effort of police forces going around warrantless access to metadata and data that private companies are already collecting on people. So clearly, I think, at least in the US context, a discussion around warrants and when and where do the police get to access certain kinds of data becomes relevant. And it's a bit ambiguous, or you touch on it multiple different ways. Are we talking about data that's just being collected by these robots? Are we talking about the robot being able to access, say, your additional personal data based on maybe a biometric, or even, you know, requesting your ID? Like police can check your license plate and things like that. And now they have access to huge amounts of data about you. What's admissible in that data? And what could potentially inform any automated decisions that police robot would then make in terms of deciding to stop you, question you, give you any kinds of directives, or potentially arrest you or use armed violence against you, and these other things, versus also what kind of data is being collected by this robot that would then be permanently become part of an archive owned by the police or the state that could be used to track your actions over time, to go back years later and see what you've been up to. And some of the conundrums that come out of that, especially with GDPR, this idea that you have a right to know what data is in there. So can I go to the police department and get like all the data they have on me? Can I do that if I'm the subject of an investigation, or if I'm a suspect in a crime? And can I change and correct it if it's wrong, and I say it's wrong, and I say, oh no, I wasn't at this place at this date and time, and I want to correct that, maybe because it implicates me in a crime. Yeah, so I think there's clearly reasons that we might want to have the police not have to subject themselves to GDPR in certain cases. And I don't know how that would work in Europe and in the States. Maybe there's some sort of reverse one where they don't have to show you what they have until later. Although there's also all these weird laws about what police conduct is like in the US that is problematic for these sorts of things, which is police can lie to you. That's not a crime. No longer, under the new Supreme Court decision recently, they no longer have to read you your Miranda rights and inform you that you don't have to provide them information or answer questions, which is a huge transformation. So this opens questions about deception, manipulation, the whole discussion we had earlier today on that subject. But now you have not just a commercial robot who's doing an advertisement, but a robot that's representing the state, and with all the coercive power of the state behind it. So it can arrest you, it can put you in jail potentially, charge you with a crime, use force against you in a way that an advertising robot can't, hopefully. And then there's a whole range of questions around sensors. So of course, we're familiar with the cameras and audio recording capabilities, but we also have, you know, LiDAR and thermal imagery, X-ray, backscatter, biometric identification, whether that's face identification or any of a large number of biometric identification elements, all of which raise serious privacy questions. And if you need a blueprint for how you might try to think about that, I think there's a guy who wrote a book, Woody, the Privacy Blueprint, that would be very helpful in that regard. But we can also then kind of ask this question. So like, this doesn't just apply to robots. Like, we can just have sensor pods. We already have security cameras, closed circuit TVs. More and more countries, even in Europe, are, you know, installing street level cameras all over cities. And we have now these data network centers within police departments that are collecting vast amounts of data through these sensor technologies. Not necessarily robotic, but enormously concerning from a privacy perspective. And so all of those issues are there too, which raises these questions like, well, some of your guidelines are things like, well, we should delete data, old data fairly soon after it's not needed. Well, how soon is that, right? And if you find out much later that a crime has happened, don't you want to have that data available for review? But I think, and this is where maybe we need a much broader notion of a warrant. Like, what are the justifications for accessing that data? How do we keep track of who's accessing that data and the purposes that it's being used for, and ensuring that, you know, it's conforming to the GDPR and the LED and what other kind of privacy blueprint we want to impose on that. And beyond that, I think why you think about robots, or what's interesting about robots, comes to interaction, right? Because we don't really interact with cameras and sensors sort of directly. They sense us, but it's very one way. But the robot can move through physical space. It can interact with us physically. And then even more problematically, it can interact with us socially and talk to us, engage with us. And so now you have a whole another set of these human robot interaction issues that come up when you start thinking about that. On the physical level, a lot of that comes down to violence. I'll come back to that in a moment because that's where they end the paper. But in terms of the social interaction, what does it really mean to be to patrol, right? You kind of get into this a little bit with the difference between police who are patrolling from a car versus police who are patrolling on foot. And a lot of community policing has emphasized foot patrols because it engages officers in interactions with the community that are not just surveillance, right? Whereas a car tends to be, you know, you're surveying things from the car and then maybe you're rapidly going to the scene of a crime. But community policing puts the police in these contexts where they have other ways of interacting with the public that are far more complex. And so patrol means very different things in those contexts. And I think if we think about a robot, we just sort of maybe think of a pattern it might use to essentially surveil an area. And is it actually going to be capable of these other kinds of interactions? And, you know, maybe it gives out lollipops to kids or something too, right? Or tells jokes or something. Which also comes to these questions about, well, what do they look like and how will people react to robots? And what is the sort of public perception of this robot? And you focus then, of course, on dogs. And dogs are interesting as a sort of physical form. And we've seen the Spot robot out in the hall yesterday. But of course, they could use any kind, and Nightscope has this sort of more droid, white pod looking patrol bot that has many of the same functions, though it doesn't have the arm capability, and it's not walking, lets you go in more uneven terrain and things like that. But what are the advantages and also disadvantages of mimicking a dog, which they bring up? On the one hand, we are sort of familiar with dogs, so maybe they're less scary. We don't expect dogs to necessarily interact with us the way people do, so it gauges or dials our expectations of interactions in certain ways. But there's these other effects too, that maybe people are scared of dogs. And I recall the moment in the documentary film When We Were Kings, which is about the rumble in the jungle, Ali versus Foreman, where Foreman comes off the plane for the first time in Zaire with these two German shepherds, which the Belgian colonial powers had used to suppress those people for decades, and they hated German shepherds. And here's Sloan with these German shepherds, and he instantly lost public support the moment he comes off the plane because of the dogs, right? So people have these very different associations with them, and police dogs and work dogs in particular, police dogs have been used for very violent applications, as well as sniffing drugs, part of a whole sort of carceral system that is problematic in a lot of ways. And then there's the, you know, McGruff, the crime dog in the US, right? So there's also the sort of cute factor, but it could go the other way if you want to make robots cute. But do you want your police to be aggressive, or do you want your police to be cute? And those are very different design goals, really. But there's a whole then sets of questions around anthropomorphism and biomorphisms. Deception, is the robot deceiving you in some sense by presenting itself as a dog when it's not a dog? Is it, you know, what are your expectations if you make a humanoid looking robot about its capabilities being human? And also whether and how it can interact. So the dog has the arms, so it can do some assisting things. Like if you dropped your groceries, maybe it could help you pick up your groceries, which like a foot patrol officer could do as part of community engagement. But if you're, a drone flying around, you can't really do that. If you don't have arms, you can't do that. So the morphic form of the robot has these other implications as well. But there's so many more things to worry about, as I said, influence and manipulation. This robot compels you to interact with it because it's a representative of the state. It says police on the side of it. And even if it's not armed, there's implicitly a threat of violence or other forms of coercion that the state has available behind that robot, which makes it a very different kind of design problem from a human robot interaction perspective than a lot of these other robots that we've talked about. And the potential then for both alienation and oppression of the people that would be interacting with, and what that means for vulnerable populations, children, the elderly, the disabled, foreign language speakers, right? If you start interacting with it in German and I don't speak German, and then next thing I know, the dog is arresting me, could be a problem. Okay, and so then you also have all these sort of physical interactions that you might think are normal police activities that are not requiring armed violence. And the example you give most frequently was the use in China of drones to detect people's temperature and inform them of the lockdowns and ensure that they're not leaving their homes and they're wearing masks and all of that. So you have these sorts of activities that a robot might do. In general, I think what you want robots to do are the dirty, dangerous, dull sorts of jobs, right? And so those could involve violence between humans, but the robot itself not necessarily having violence. Like a robot that could break up a fight, or a bar fight or something like that would be really helpful, because an officer would very easily be hurt in those sorts of situation. But you can prevent two other people from hurting each other. And certainly in domestic violence situations, you get something similar. And really you want to think about then, how do you get these systems to de-escalate violent situations, and how do you think about programming that? And then from the subjective perspective of a robot or a human robot interaction being de-escalatory, which is very different than a human sort of authority figure. So that's where you maybe want that authority figure represented robotically, but also crowd control. If you have large demonstrations or even just concerts where you don't want people stampeding and things like that, you could have these kinds of robots. Traffic control, another sort of thing that might be interesting to think about. And then you have potential, and I think you're right that we shouldn't arm these. There's many reasons we shouldn't arm police robots. And I think even apart from questions about automating the decision to use lethal force and making it a killer robot that would have the capacity to autonomously decide to use lethal force without a human intervening, there's a whole set of questions about remote armed robots, any kind of armed robot, really. Because the question is, why do robots need to use violent or lethal force? They don't have a right to self-defense, which is the justification for police to use violent force in most cases. If we actually look to the UN standards on police use of force and firearms, it's very clear that there's very limited circumstances where police should use violent force or lethal force, and it's essentially to protect the immediate threat of death or extreme violence between two other people, or self-defense. So you don't have self-defense. So the only case would be, somebody's holding a gun to the hostage's head. Now we have to use lethal force. But in some of my papers have touched on this. In most situations, the robot could sacrifice itself, put itself between the threat and the person being threatened. And the application of these rules in the US compared to Germany, I think goes a long way towards explaining the 8 incidents of use of lethal force in Germany versus the 1,098 per year in the US. Is that the US doesn't conform to this at all. Like police can shoot suspects who are fleeing, which is completely not acceptable in Germany and not acceptable under international standards. And it happens all the time. So the other kinds of dangerous situations that we might want to use them are really, I think, search and rescue and the hostage situations or barricaded subject situations. And you don't really need arms for that. I think for most of those cases, and in fact, and I've had interesting conversations with the lawyer from Boston Dynamics, Brendan Schulman, on the fact that if you want to do a hostage negotiation, you want that robot to be able to get in to talk to the hostage taker. You don't want them to think it's armed. So you want the general public to believe that none of your robots are armed, because we're not going in there to kill you. We're going in there to, give you a pizza and a telephone and talk out the situation. So as soon as you start arming them, then everybody's going to be afraid of them and they're not going to let them in. So now you can't use them for those situations. It defeats the whole purpose of them. So really you want unarmed robots. You bring up a couple of really interesting cases, which are really interesting because they're really complicated and they're really bad cases for thinking about what we should do, because there are definitely things we shouldn't do. So the first is the New York Police Department's DigiDog Boston Dynamics dog, which had a sort of public relations fiasco, where they acquired this dog. I don't know that they had a clear idea what they wanted to do with it. It was supposed to be for these kinds of situations that I described. They did have a subject who was barricaded in a housing project. They brought the dog. I think the dog got to the lobby before they resolved the situation, but it was filmed coming out of the lobby and they knew what happened in the situation. And there was a huge public outcry and they got rid of the dog. Okay, the flip story, and what's the sort of better side is now the fire department of New York has these dogs and nobody's concerned about that, right? Because we don't think, we're not going to arm fire department robot, right? And of course, those Dalmatians are really cute. So I think that helps too. The other case is the Dallas Police Department, and I think it was 2014, no, 16. During a Black Lives Matter demonstration, there was a sniper who had shot several police officers and barricaded himself in a community college. And they used their bomb, the Dallas Police Department and sort of cornered them and negotiated for, I think, about 8 or 12 hours with the subject over the phone, and then decided to use their bomb disposal robot to deliver a bomb to blow up the subject and a good chunk of the building. I think it's a terrible use. Again, it's like you can sort of do that once, and now what other suspect is going to let the robot come in? Nobody. I don't think police should be using bombs, like in general, as a tactic either, because it's enormously dangerous to the public. And it's also a situation where there was not actually, there's a sense in which there's an immediate threat. There's an armed person who's promised to do more violence, but you have time, and that time could have been continued until the person maybe changed their mind or some other resolution had happened. So it wasn't immediately necessary to use violent lethal force. And that was teleoperated in that case. So there was no autonomous weapons involved. Okay, so your recommendations and like the I think, coolest part of what your paper does. Your suggestions are to have purpose-driven deployments. So you only use robots in police departments for very specific tasks and acquire those robots just to do those tasks. I think that makes sense. You want to assess the impact on citizen rights. That sounds great. Transparency and accountability, wonderful things, but boy, is it going to be complicated once you start the social interactions, the physical interactions, and don't even get started with armed robots. Those things are going to be really, really tough. But the coolest part is this model that you present for thinking about this, which is this police citizen robot state interaction. And instead of thinking about it as, myself trying to critique police departments or how a designer might think about building the robot, you're starting from the perspective of how is the state going to represent itself to its citizenry through the robot. And I think thinking about it that way, and then thinking, okay, so how does the public respond to robots in various ways? What does that mean for the state, the authority of the state? How do we then, respect human rights? And I think the paper we had yesterday on the human in the loop It's a very clear case where you have a human on the loop because you want human dignity, right? And what that means in this context, I think, is very useful. And that whole kind of model of thinking about how do we ensure the dignity of citizens in these interactions, and that there's no racial bias, there's no other sorts of bias, that we aren't harassing people through this robot, we aren't terrorizing people through this robot. And I think that model is a great way to do that. But again, I think it's very different to think about the sort of ethics of implementing this kind of system in Germany versus the US, where you have a very dysfunctional police system and a very racist police system that's very prone to the overuse of violence. The idea that you would insert robots into that and try to make it better, I think is really problematic. But obviously the German context is very different. And it does make more sense there. But I think you still have this lens of how is the state going to be perceived through these interactions. And then there's also, I think, interesting questions about what manufacturers can do. And Boston Dynamics in particular has licensing things that restrict the use of weapons on their systems. And I think those are really good and positive ways to prevent departments from applying these things when they shouldn't. And then I think another way to think about it, and I have a paper on predictive policing that you might look at, which looks at how data gets used by police. And instead of, because I think it actually gives you an opportunity to think about what is the role of the police in the state, right? We want security and we want safety. What does that mean today? And instead of thinking of what I call in that paper models of threat, right? So there's a bunch of bad guys out there and we have to optimize the collection and destruction of bad guys. We think about the ethics of care. What does it mean to create a community in which people are safe and secure? And what is the role of the police in that community? And how do we then optimize data systems and robot systems to do that? So, but great paper.
Shall I just start with a few remarks and then maybe you take over for surveillance and GDPR and law enforcement? Okay. So first of all, thank you for your comments. I wrote down a lot of notes. I think one of the first things I want to mention, the German police force isn't perfect. I mean, we don't have certain problems that come with having weapons everywhere. I mean, I've seen actually a sign in a bar in Seattle that said, here, no firearms allowed. And I was like, okay, could people walk in a bar with firearms? And then I realized, yeah, okay, that's actually happening. It's really weird for me and it actually makes me a little bit uncomfortable. But yeah, so we don't have that. So naturally, the police is kind of in a different situation when they respond to emergencies. They don't typically expect someone to be armed. And then they also don't go in weapons first and shooting as soon as something moves. Although I have to say that occasionally happens. Last year, or in the beginning of this year, 2 police officers were actually shot by a guy at a traffic stop, but they didn't expect it because typically people aren't armed. So I think the most important thing to remember is, yeah, police institutions work in a certain way. There's a certain culture. There's a certain, I think they call it core spirit. They kind of feel this, yeah, community among the officers. And inserting technology into that is always a little bit, yeah, influenced by how this institution works. And there are always certain dangers to that. And they are, I guess, different depending on the country, or at least maybe it's more of a question of, yeah, how problematic certain behaviors are. And it's kind of a, yeah, question of the grade. And what we really wanted to focus is on the robot being teleoperated. So there's definitely a human in the loop, or basically just a human puppeteer. And with just very limited semi-autonomous functions, to really focus on the technology that's here right now, that's already being used. And I think that's really important. And apart from that,
yeah, we had a small disagreement on this during the writing of the paper, so I'm remembering now the first paper, Margot, and like also you showing like how you had a different approach. I was more into also what you touched on, Peter, more like where will it go if we combine this with other data and if they are armed and if they can use taser guns and so on. And Caroline was always pretty much, let's stay with the models that we have. And this turned out to be a very good idea, I think, at the end. Because you go into something speculative sometimes because you could imagine all these things, but just looking where are we now? And then also here being able to see spot kind of and seeing that proven that there is no meaningful social interaction possible with this robot. I mean, it's just, it just has this, you know, arm. I cannot say something back. You don't have, you know, any way of socially interacting. So this proved out to be interesting to see what we have. And it also added to our analysis that somehow there is, also we talked yesterday about it, that there is no market really for robots for law enforcement. Either they do military things or they're more in the industrial scale. And how do you actually tender as a police agency or law enforcement agency the model that you want, which is privacy by design, which is maybe has more transparency inside, and which has more logging, more these things. So there might be not even a model on the market because you cannot customize the existing models. So it could lead into a situation where there is just, you choose from industrial or household robots or private robots or the military robots, and both would be problematic. And that's why how we came up with this way to look at it also. Just want to say one thing because I'm really interested about the discussion also. First of all, it's a very good influence from Kirsten's paper on robots and the public space, which I also realized again coming to US how different the public space is in different cultures. Like walking through Seattle after 10 p.m., I saw, you know, a lot of poverty, a lot of crime, and no open places. I couldn't eat anywhere after 10. Beautiful parks, but nobody chilled at the park. You know how I'm used to do it in Berlin. So this changing, so also what you're saying, adding a robot into this situation of like a deserted city, which is very busy with like seemingly rich or well-earning people. And then at night, you're actually scared walking around the block and you don't find anything to eat. That's of course a different thing than using really public space, which is well curated or even curatable. So this was quite interesting also combining that. And to close with, it was the first thing I had when I got out of the Amtrak. There was this big Seahawks game. And the first thing I saw was a canine unit looking for explosives. So it was kind of my personal welcome to Seattle, was actually running into a canine unit and thinking about, could this be replaced by a robot? And I realized in this case, you know, no robot would smell the explosive that well, maybe as the dog. So also a nice way, and looking forward to further discussion.
Yeah, thank you for the talk, and Peter as well. Selfishly, I would urge you to consider the American context and sort of think about this problem through the lens of racial terrorism and other. I think footnote 149, I would love y'all to reflect on some of the literature in that a bit more. As a bit of a comment, so a 2020 study from the Marshall Project, which is a nonprofit criminal justice organization, police dog bites cause more hospital visits than any other kind of police force in the United States. And a 2019 study showed that between the years of 2005 and 2013, of the 32,951 people who were sent to a hospital by a dog bite, 42% of them were Black. I think for the purposes of this paper, for future audiences who might leverage this paper, I think it will do justice to consider the the US framework, but also maybe deal with the question of like police abolition, the literature around whether we should have police, or even the question of whether police dogs should exist at all. I think that I would want to see that in the paper. And I guess I would caution as well as I think not reflecting on that context, I could see US departments leveraging some of this literature in ways that might, align some of those most structural and historical concerns. But thank you for your paper.
Thank you so much. That's a great hint. I'm really looking forward to any kind of hints in this kind of space, because we're not really deep into the literature of yeah, critical police studies or critical race studies. I did a little bit in like the critical police field, which I find very interesting, but I just don't have the time to really dive deep into it. So if anyone has any comments on that, they're already always welcome.
So thanks for the paper, which I found really interesting and useful, and suspect will be kind of splashy, and like many people will refer to this. I had two thoughts. The first was, I don't think you should just do the US, but I think it's probably quite useful to be explicit about what frame you're thinking about. So I found your comments about, here's why these issues seem quite different to us in the context of the German police force. That struck me as the kind of thing that's worth making rather explicit when you're at least implicitly making that move to kind of bring that out. The second point is a broader one. So I was really heartened by your third sentence in the piece that says something along the lines of, but we shouldn't compare these robots to dogs because they're only vaguely reminiscent of canines. And I thought, yeah, that's totally right. And I thought you were going to go in the direction of the literature that we've been hearing about fake anthropomorphization and all of these questions about what happens when we say that these robots are things that they aren't. But then, of course, for much of the paper, you rather explicitly compare them to canines and describe them as dogs, and even gender them at some point. You know, you talk about Spot as a he, like he goes into a building a couple times. And I was surprised by that move. It was not what I expected given the introduction. And I'm curious as to whether that was kind of a deliberate thought to say, like, yeah, because it's a real intellectual move to say we should treat them as if they are analogs to dogs, as opposed to these are four-legged robots that do things, and they occupy some roles that police dogs do, but other roles that aren't. And like, here's why we might want to guard against calling them dogs. So I was just wondering if you could say a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, this he thing is a little bit, I didn't intend that. I crossed some out at the last minute, and it's probably because of the German background that a Hund is a he, a dog. It's always kind of male, so that's probably kind of the problem. But thanks for saying that. I will check the entire paper and cross out any type of pronouns that aren't neutral. And also, thank you for your criticism. I'm kind of still struggling with this whole canine, is it canine, is it not thing. I just found the metaphor kind of appealing, but probably more from a creative, literary perspective than from an actual regulative one. And I guess we kind of need to discuss that, but I think we also might have a different view on that. So if you have any thoughts.
It's maybe also you detected a bit the process that we went through by writing the paper, because at first sight you think, oh, this is a dog, and you can compare to, I mean, you just as a scientist, and then you look into the literature on police dogs, you see there is a lot of interesting things here, even, you know, drug sniffing dogs in the Fourth Amendment. We had one paper that we analyzed and so on. So first they seem so similar, and then the more we looked into it, it actually just looks, you know, like a dog. And it doesn't even and then we even thought, is it why a dog? I mean, it could be also a, you know, llama, or it could be, you know, whatever animal. Yeah, no, not a llama. It's just sorry, no, looks. What's that? You know, just some you know, some other animals which look like dogs. So even that is like questionable if it's really a dog. So we came away from that idea more and more. To actually, because the comparison doesn't hold up much. Instead of they go around and we describe also the differences, and we found more and more differences. And then from the first thing to say, this is a good story to tell, like to comparing them to canine units, we realized more and more that actually it's not really like that. And yeah, the he, she, and kind of making the person, this is just draw the foreigner card here, since it was not intentionally really, yeah.
Hi, everyone. Brendan Schulman from Boston Dynamics. I'm Vice President of Policy and Government Relations for the company, so I'm deeply interested in your paper, and I thank you for it. I think it's great to see people writing at this depth and breadth about our products and their impact in communities and in the world. And in fact, I'm quite admire the paper for not just focusing on the weaponization topic, which obviously is in the news a lot and we feel strongly about. And I think, as was mentioned by Peter, we have our terms and conditions that prohibit it. So I'm glad that you got into questions of community space, privacy in the home, data protection, and so forth, because those are things that, although they don't capture as many headlines about us, we certainly internally have been thinking about them a lot. I would love to see this paper turn into something that's referred to and useful in policy discussions that I'm having in sort of academic circles. And so in that respect, I have a comment and then a couple of questions for you. And by the way, as Dan was suggesting in his paper yesterday, the notion that manufacturers or developers can help lead policy discussions and set favorable policies that help solve problems, that's something we very much would love to do in collaboration. So for me, this is a good starting point that I think can help us all get to the right outcome for these technologies in society. So I guess my comment is the part of the paper that's about GDPR and data protection. It seems to me it's not very robot specific. It's a good discussion of all the things that folks and in particular police departments should be considering and thoughtful of when it comes to data collection. I think it would be stronger to see that more specifically aligned with what's different about a robot. Is it just the same as a surveillance camera on a lamppost, or is there something different about the mobile nature of the robot that compels something different when it comes to the legal or policy analysis under those provisions in Europe or elsewhere? Couple of questions. So your discussion, this is page 18 on private space, and this is with reference to the NYPD incident that's been referred to a few times. I'm really curious to know what you would consider to be a way to resolve this challenge about respecting, right to respect of the home and the right to be secure in houses against unreasonable searches, such as the Fourth Amendment provisions. Something like would a warrant requirement help? If you're sending a robot in instead of a police officer, would you expect to see either a warrant issued or an exception to the warrant requirement under the Fourth Amendment? I think that could take this very succinct discussion that flags the issue one step further towards something that could actually be implemented in policy. So I'd be curious to hear what you think about a solution to that, to protecting those rights. Separately, towards the back, page 58, on accountability and liability, you have a discussion or maybe a proposal that there be strict liability for robots when used by police. And I, at least personally speaking, strict liability, I tend to think we reserve for dangerous products, things that are really troublesome. And as I approach tech policy issues, I previously worked in the drone industry, the civilian commercial drone industry. And I never really liked to see a rule or a law that was discriminatory against a technology just because it's new or scary or the subject of science fiction. So if there's a reason to impose a strict liability framework on the robots because they do something that's more hazardous than other kinds of police technologies, I'd love to hear what that is or see it in the paper. Otherwise, I feel like, let's not take robots, which I think many of us believe are a good technology for society overall once we address problems. I wouldn't want to see them subject to a higher level of scrutiny or strict liability just because they're robots and they walk around like dogs and they're kind of scary. Thank you.
Okay, I can take this. Yeah, about not being robot specific enough, this is a problem of GDPR, and here the LED, it just looks at data processing of personal data, and there is no specific rules on robots, but you have a point there, and maybe we can pin it down a bit more what the robotic specifics are, which we have in the following chapter at the end to say how is robots a bit different and why can we not just put data protection law on it. About the private spaces and home search, this is, I'm not a US constitutional lawyer, so I will not talk about Fourth Amendment things because I'm really not into that. The German constitutional law perspective is maybe a bit different. I mean, there is also Article, I think 13 it is, like the private homes is protected, and usually already from this point of view, if you have some audio or visual surveillance inside a house, you need a warrant already. It's like already in the Constitution. And just want to point to the difference of sending a police officer inside than sending the robot, again, from the citizen perspective. You know that the police officer who walks in doesn't have an installed memory and will know all the details, what's in your bookshelf and what's laying around where and who else is in it. And it will also not film your neighbors potentially. So I think there needs to be a proportionate use. It's not, you can send them always in. Maybe there is some things where it said it's proportionate in this dangerous situation with not many other data subjects being concerned. But it is one of the most interesting fields where we were also working on a German publication where we look into really the police law of that. So, but it's an interesting case. And about strict liability, I mean, this is something which is more commonly used, I think, in the European context. We have a form of strict liability, for example, also about cars which are moving on the streets. So if you are the holder of a car, you're always liable just for having it. Also animals, we talked about it yesterday, bees, or you own a horse, you're just responsible for it because there's unexpected emergent behavior which is possible. So for me, it's like the specific, it's a robot. It's first of all, it's early on technology. If you want to market it, then you should take the strict liability or wait 10 years to use it, you know. But then I think if you go into cost benefits, you would still say, well, better make it now with the strict liability than wait 10 years until it's predictable enough in all ways. So I would, give that back maybe, but we can also go more into detail. Thank you.
Can I just do a two-finger of what are the rules of police body cameras in Germany?
It's a little bit fragmented because we are also a federal state, but some Bundesländer, they have rules on that. But they can only be on for a certain amount of time, like turn on in certain situations.
You have to warn before and it has to have a light.
I think it's typically like safe for 3 days.
Hi, Kristen Thomason from UBC. Thank you for generously mentioning my paper. That was very nice of you. I really enjoyed reading your paper. I'll try to be really quick because I know there's 4 of us. So one thing I wanted to mention is that on the dog analogy, Ian Kerr has this paper brilliantly called Snoop Dogs that you might find really helpful on that. It's on like real dogs, but if to the extent that you're drawing an analogy to dogs, it might be interesting for your paper. And then the second thing I want to say is just that, so your triangle of interaction, I thought was such an interesting point of analysis in your paper. So this idea that like the dog is mediating an interaction with the state, but in a way that interaction can be concealed or potentially manipulative in a way that it wouldn't be if we were talking to a human being or engaging with a human being. I just thought there was so much, there's so much interesting analysis that could happen in there. And I would love to see that section expanded. And I really want to give a +1 to Jevon's comment. Like, I think that could be a place where you could also really engage, if you were going to take this on, like engage with some of the abolitionist literature as well. But the point that really struck me is just it, and you can push back on this if I'm wrong, but it feels like in your paper, there's an assumption that police are going to use this tool. So let's think about what that means. And I think that your triangle really to me feels like a point where we should be asking, does that have to be the outcome? Like, is it deterministic that this is going to happen? Or could there really be an important conversation around whether or not this is a legitimate tool to be used by an agency or a department with so much power, especially given what it can conceal or what might be rendered invisible through the use of the tool, including the expansion of police violence. So I just think there's so much to say there, and it's a super interesting part of the paper. So I'd love to see, like, if you extrapolate that in any way. Thank you.
I'm not sure if I can shortly respond. Just to clarify, police in Germany is a little bit broader. In general, police does everything that's related to safety and security. I think 300 years ago, they were responsible for the safety of steam pots in industrial areas. So it's really broad. So if you have a natural catastrophe, you would also you would have the police deploy that robot. So it's a little bit not only related to oppressing citizens, it's also just normal recon stuff. but thank you for your comment, and it's really helped. I noted it down the paper. I'll check it out.
That an expansion of that history in the paper could be super interesting as well.
Hi, Ben Winters from Epic. Super quick point. I would love for you to dive a little bit deeper into like a mechanism for the purpose-driven deployment that you sort of, say, I love the idea, and I love the concept of like justification for the adoption of a given tool, especially in light of the, sort of, and I'm coming from an American perspective, but sort of like the role that police or any sort of government function has. Does it like raise the bar? Does that, change how that mechanism should be done? And so I'd love some sort of exploration on that, because you do mention the data protection impact assessments and how that can be sort of expanded, but it goes beyond the data protection and sort of towards these like existential questions of like, why do we even need this? Just because cops are doing it this one way now doesn't mean we should keep doing it digitally or whatever. So thanks.
So last week I was at a policing and use of force conference. And just a couple of points sort of from there that might be useful to you. So sometimes in these discussions, there's an assumption that what the police do is law enforcement, and that policing is all about crime in some way. So in the United States, only a tiny percentage of police activity has anything to do with law enforcement or crime. There's a very famous article by Egon Bittner. It's called Florence Nightingale in Pursuit of Willie Sutton from 1974, right? And there's a lot of updating of that, but most of what police do has to do with they are the all-purpose sort of presence of government to deal with any kind of problem, and law enforcement is only a tiny percentage. And so I think that the assumption that police robots are going to be involved in law enforcement as their primary function, that might turn out to be incorrect. It might be that that's what the currently designed robots are doing or not, but it's not necessarily what robots will do. Just on the encounter with criminals and use of force aspect of this, one possibly positive role of robots there is that they don't have to defend themselves, and they couldn't defend themselves with force under existing law. So that means that one of the major causes of injuries by police use of force would drop out, right? If you assume that police robots would be involved in, for instance, apprehension of suspects, we wouldn't have this problem that self-defense would trigger the use of lethal force. So I think it's a complicated question, and there's a huge literature on use of force, the circumstances in which it's justified. You might want to consider the interaction. Obviously, what I've said so far is mostly about the United States, and all of this can be different in different national contexts.
Hello, I have a question from one of our remote participants. So unfortunately, Michael Frumkin couldn't be here, but he has a quick question for you where he says, page 41 suggests police might want to require cute dog design, or at least something less threatening than current models, to minimize citizen distrust. Is there a risk that this becomes manipulative in a way that the Deepola Darling paper would disfavor? If so, is this a problem that needs more foregrounding in the concluding recommendations?
Well, yeah, we talked about this. Also, it's the RoboSloth idea came somehow about discussing about how cute should it be, how approachable should it be, how can it be not uncanny to meet this robot. And we had this one scenario that we also mentioned in the paper is like a person who is scared to walk at home at night, could call a robot to walk home through the park and play their favorite song. And when someone is coming too close, just the police is alarmed or some light goes on or, whatever. And for this, you need some kind of approachable thing. But of course, you could overdo it also. I mean, if it's like this nice, cute pink poodle coming up to you and say, hey guys, you are not allowed to drink outside, this is also not what you want. And it could be manipulative and it could, but this is part of the deployment scenario that we say. It should be purpose driven. If you want to interact with people, you should design it different than if you want to intimidate people. This needs to be considered. So it maybe shouldn't even be the same model doing both.
Police the time a little bit on this one, but I just want to make sure to get us a little back on track. But that was absolutely generative and really exciting. Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking this great team. This is the last session of We Robot 2022. Thank you for sticking through the whole thing, thick and thin. But believe me, you're gonna be excited about this. You're gonna like this. Yeah, we're ending with a bang. All right. We have a kind of robot irony going on here, which is that Laurel Wright, who's on our program committee, who's a roboticist, she is appearing remotely through a robot that was on loan from another robotics shop here on campus. We said Laura was like, can I appear remotely? And I was like, I'm sorry, we really are not set up to support that. And she's like, no problem, I'm gonna phone a couple favors. And lo and behold, they just ship a robot over to her and she's here. The irony is, of course, that her co-author, Ellen Bjorling, I'm probably mispronouncing that, unfortunately, sorry about that, is not able to come, but she's our colleague here at the University of Washington. She's a senior research scientist in human-centered design and engineering. I hope you get a chance to meet her at some point if you are local, a very interesting researcher. Sorry not to have her, but Laurel, thank you for being so creative and finding a way here. So anyway, I'm going out of order, but I'll just say that those two, Ellen and Laurel, are the authors of Designing for Exit, How to Let Robots Go. Our own prodigal son, Jevin Hudson, is here from Hinsey Law Firm. He's incredibly interesting interdisciplinary researcher who, while he was a student here, reached out across departments and wrote multiple papers with authors in different disciplines here in the campus and even on other campuses. Absolutely a model for how to get the most out of being a law student in R1 institution. Way to go, and is doing really wonderful things in private practice. And Ben Winters, who I've been following for some time. He's at the Electronic Privacy Information Center, which is the premier privacy research and advocacy organization in DC. So good to see you here. And theirs is, gosh, I mean, there's been some great titles, but this one is maybe takes the cake. America's Next Stop Model, Algorithmic Discouragement. Got to say that is pretty great. And then last, but definitely not least, the great Meg Jones. You've heard people reference her over and over again. She's repeatedly asked questions without saying what she was. You've seen her from such things as. No, I mean, among the deepest scholars in the technology and society space, she is an STS, Science Technology Studies professor in the communications department at Georgetown. She's one of the leads of their technology and society program across all the campuses. She is a dear friend and also at the heart of I'm not getting choked up. Excuse me, I just coughed. I'm all good. Also at the heart of this conference for many years now, and my frequent interlocutor. So I'm going to hand you into her capable hands and just say, enjoy the last session of this great conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you all for sticking around. But I want you to all look up at me from your screens and take a second and dig real deep, because the last session of most conferences peters out, and we are not going to do that. These two papers are too good for that. So I just want you to look at me, take a deep breath, and like bring it for one last hour, and then you can go off. Okay. I was so thrilled when I saw these abstracts come in, because together they brought up something that I've just not thought about in robotics. And I think we at We Robot have not thought about yet, which is just the end phase of robotics, and I don't mean the end times, which we have thought about some, but I mean like the final chapter or retirement or recycling. I don't even think we know. I don't think we have terms for it. And both of these papers help us talk about something that just has not come up yet. When I was reading the papers as complete drafts, I had just finished reading the novel School for Good Mothers, which is really popular, but I keep bringing it up and no one here has read it. Just go read it. It's by this great first-time author named Jessamine Chan, and it's about parenting and family standards and the technical furtherance of those standards. And there's robots, and I will give you no more spoilers, and instead say that the book made me think about the training babies that lots of people had to use in high school. If you're American and you went to a public school and you had one of these training babies, will you raise your hand? Okay, if you didn't, but you watched some US TV in the 90s or 2000s, there's always an episode that involves the training baby with the high school students. Yeah. And today, this is still a thing. Today we have the Real Care Baby 3 is in 2/3 of school districts around the country. And it got me thinking about like, where do these babies go? Are they like upgraded? Like what happens to them at the end of the semester? Do they get like shoveled away? Do they get like reprogrammed? You know, how do these babies, how do these babies deal with this cycle? What is the cycle of baby robots? And I bring this all up to highlight what makes the end a uniquely interesting question for us as a community. And that's the special features of robots that have been surfaced and debated at this conference. They include, relevant to this panel, they include the immense data gathering involved, investment in algorithmic innovation, the anthropomorphic attachment we develop toward them, and the way that we take advantage of that attachment, maybe inappropriately. See School for Good Mothers. And then there's the materiality of the robots themselves. Of course, computers have their own materiality, but robots have bodies, and retiring or burying or recycling or trashing or otherwise ending a body creates potentially challenging processes for our existing cultural practices, our institutions, our policy goals. So the differences in the paper, one largely about algorithms, though I think maybe also robots, and one definitely about robots, highlights some of those distinctions and allow for us to have a rich conversation around this. And these are also interesting for this conversation, for this community, because many of us, though not all of us, have advocated for bans on technologies, including killer drones and facial recognition technology. But there's something different about bans and destruction that bring up different ideas about preservation and legacy and history that force us to ask a slightly different set of questions that I don't think we've asked yet. So we have two papers to discuss. I wasn't planning on Floral Robot being here. And so my notes are kind of set up in a funky way. I think it'll still be fine. Because we all took that deep breath and we're going to make this awesome. But I'm going to go through this paper first, and there's sort of fewer questions for Laurel, but I'm sure we'll have tons for her. So I'm going to start with Ellen and Laurel's paper, which has the ultimate goal of giving users control over their engagement and disengagement with robots by establishing a new design principle, designing for exit. It is the opposite of stickiness. I think that is such a helpful way to frame it. Designing for stickiness, right, is designing for continual engagement. This is the opposite. This is designing for exit. How do we design for disengagement? Why do we need this? Well, HRI is great at engagement. It's a central tenet, as the authors write. But the field of HRI has largely focused on how to establish and maintain connections, but rarely on how to end them. And that's not great because robots are not forever. And people get attached to them. So yanking a robot out of an elder care home or away from a children's program, or removing a robot from a military unit or a workplace or a research environment can have potentially harmful impacts on the humans in those social spaces. And that social space is the narrow target of this investigation. The authors are focused on robots in social environments. which are not necessarily social robots, but those in a shared social space with humans. They pull from de-implementation, which seems like a generally good thing used in healthcare to end the use of services or practices that are ineffective, unproven, overused, harmful, inappropriate. And they also pull from planned obsolescence, which seems like a generally bad thing. A dark design pattern intended to increase research purposes. Exit in HRI means the permanent or temporary emotional or physical separation between a user and a robot. So exit for these authors has 5 factors. It might be situational, where a user just has to leave to go do something else. A physical factor, like the robot falls into the Georgetown fountain and just breaks. Like that, yeah, the ghost of the Georgetown fountain bot. Another factor is psychosocial factors, which to me kind of read as like the whole body. I've never heard that term before, but health status, physical ability, social connections, psychological responses. Gatekeepers might keep people away from a robot. A manager or researcher might control access, and market factors. So lots of robot companies just go out of business, right? Like that's a reality, certainly. So these can result in exits that are abrupt, painful, denied, or the result of sabotage. And these are potentially harmful types of exits. So to mitigate that harm, they set forth 5 principles: allow for a user-directed exit, plan for a robot exit, engage the user in discussion of exit, expect the unexpected robot exit, design for continuity of use. These participatory principles are meant as conversation starters, but then they walk us through how they use the principles with teens, not to train them to not have babies, but instead robots used in mental health research. And they finish with this brief sort of how-to guide that others can do. So this paper lit up a number of neurons in my brain. I was thinking about death positive movements and getting out of gym memberships. But the most relevant to Ben and Jevin's piece were the recognition of a non-user and data minimization. So the non-user is an STS concept, an STS person who can't or doesn't want to use a system. Ellen and Laurel might ask, how can a designer support the transition from user and non-user and back and forth? But wait, what do you do when an automated system built on extraction and manipulation of non-user data? What do you do with that? Smash it, maybe. But it also got me thinking about the principles of data minimization, which are supposed to include these like very thoughtful timelines about how we're going to end the use of data and destroy it, but aren't really used in practice. And I thought that might be a literature that Laurel and Ellen could look into as well, because there's some successful versions of data minimization out there. But this brings me to Ben and Jevin's piece. Ben and Jevin's paper is about the ordered destruction of Cambridge Analytica's ill-gotten data and algorithms. I love this as like the centerpiece of the paper because people know what it is and they generally have like an emotional response to it. The paper is a bit of a celebration. I feel like it's a little bit of a victory lap over the FTC's use of disgorgement. Not only did the FTC order disgorgement of Cambridge Analytica's data and algorithms in 2019, the agency used it again in 2021 against the facial recognition company Everalbum. And as a right to be forgotten person, not my favorite name that I've seen out there. The FTC's algorithmic disgorgement power was affirmed by the Northern District of California when it agreed that Weight Watchers Kurbo app for kids had gathered data and created models in violation of COPPA. So the authors argue that algorithmic disgorgement is a big deal. Yes, it does seem very cool. I am interested. Algorithmic disgorgement is, quote, the compelled destruction / dispossession of datasets, algorithms, models, and other relevant work products created or shaped by illegal means. The slash between destruction and dispossession captivated me throughout the whole thing. The authors note that normally disgorgement is for profits that are redistributable to impacted parties, but that algorithmic disgorgement involves destruction, not redistribution. And I kept wondering, but could it, it made me think of the Stasi archives, which are this famous repository of surveillance crimes in East Germany, or against the East German citizens when East Germany became no more. That building was just sort of preserved in its state, and the archive did develop over time by really talented archivists, but the files were mostly just left there, and people could go in and look at their own files. And it's just recently moved to the German National Archive to like ensure this preservation continues. And this came up with Chris before lunch, and I thought it was really interesting. And we've never really talked about it, but like, should we be preserving these in some way that disgorgement needs to account for? And if so, why? And would it put algorithmic disgorgement on firmer legal grounds? I just don't know enough about disgorgement to know if that redistribution is essential to upholding an order like that. So I just agree with most of this paper. So I really hope many of you will come and push back where you see fit. But I have a couple of other questions that I hope you guys will respond to. I'm gonna turn over to you, and please feel free, audience, to start moving towards the mic. But the authors write that algorithmic disgorgement incentivizes data set accountability. A business's entire AI work product is now on the line if they don't get data collection, security, provenance, and hygiene right. And I wondered what this would look like if the FTC had used it when Facebook violated its consent decree, or the first time the consent decree was created as sort of like a threatening stick or something. Because Kurbo and Everalbum both seem to have closed shop. I could not find them on the App Store. I went looking for these, and I couldn't really find them anywhere. But these were apps that rested on platforms that rested on larger infrastructures. And I wonder if the FTC's disgorgement policy, when it's algorithmic disgorgement, will have to account for the impact on other businesses and the impact on consumers, or does it just ignore those? Again, please just tell me more about disgorgement as this longstanding historical thing. But I'd like to talk about them separately, the businesses and the consumers, because this is all happening so far as I've been discussing it in the paper through this lens of trade and unfair trade practices. But the author suggests a couple of different places where this might get really interesting. Other agencies and maybe even individual litigants could wield the power of algorithmic disgorgement. So then we're really talking about like who can destroy these objects. I'm not exactly sure what to call them. But no matter who is disgorging it, there are challenges to that, determining the scope of the disgorgement. The lawyers in the room might be able to help really think through this, and certainly the engineers, like what's realistic here, the method of enforcing this, and how we verify that disgorgement has occurred. So as fantastic as the best version of algorithmic disgorgement sounds, I wonder if Ellen and Laurel, maybe this is gonna be my question for you too, Laurel, might see this as an intervention exit and even a painful exit that could cause harm to users. And should there be considered both in the design of the system, but also in the design of the policy tool? How should algorithmic disgorgement mitigate the harms of exit on consumers? Can algorithmic disgorgement account for the fact that I might have become really attached to my real baby 3, even if its personality was built on illegally collected data? So I thank these authors so much for this rich work. And I hope that they'll just respond maybe briefly to what I said, and then we can open it up. Laurel, do you just want to start with, can we start with you? I know there's a little bit of a lag.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so I think that I loved your summary. Thank you so much. And it's exciting to be here virtually and be on this panel. Yeah, I think that what you just stated is a great connection point and something that we should certainly think about. Certainly it gets very complicated when we want to think about how we imagine exit and envision exit in some of these more complex situations. I think when we were thinking about this paper, we were sort of thinking about situations where there was a pretty clear, things were a little bit more clear in terms of the data, and we didn't think about some of these more complex situations where this data might have been collected in sort of untoward ways, which could have an impact on how we imagine disgorgement. But I think that's a really exciting idea to consider.
Sure, I can start. Thank you, Meg, for all your notes. This is extremely interesting and exciting to hear all that, and thanks to Ryan and everyone for having us here. So to start, I guess responding, the question about could it be like a distributive to the actual consumer, it came up earlier in the discussion. I think it's really difficult. I think that like in the SEC context or financial context, you can see that, okay, you gave your money to Bernie Madoff. It has since been shown that it was very bad, and they can give you your money back. But I think the harm is a little bit less concrete in the sort of like algorithmic building and training context. And so perhaps the like supplementary monetary penalty could be distributed to individuals a la class action or something to that effect. But even that ends up having the logistical difficulties of like, all right, we'll give $4 to them, $4 to them, ends up going to like Cypre awards. So that's the distributed part. Although like, I think ideally it would be both. And the thing about the disgorgement there is that, or here, is that you're trying to say that the company should not further profit from the illegal activity and to like follow. And I think that that really connects to the whole, okay, what about when a product that is built off of illegal data or however you want to say it, is something that people like and don't want to have like destroyed. I think that the big thing that I see is that it's not really going to be super common that it's just because of the data collection. Because besides COPPA in the children's context, there's pretty much no, there's nothing illegal about pretty much any sort of input, like illicit data collection, as we all sort of understand, is in the US. And so that's why a lot of the paper is trying to argue for FTC rules and articulations of like unfair and deceptive trade practices that would then allow an enforcement action to start. And then algorithmic disgorgement, if appropriate, would be one of many sort of tools that they would be able to do. And so on that point, I am going to say that everyone in this room, if you have even 5 minutes of your life, should do the FTC rulemaking comment. And you can email me and I will give you such a right, even if you don't have time. So please do it. Yeah, it'd be really helpful.
Thank you so much. And thanks all of you for having us since this is our first We Robot, Jevin Hudson, Hitsy Law. Everything I say today does not represent my employer, nor does it represent my clients. And if I mention any of my clients in the process, I'm sorry. So to take a few of your points on sort of the preservation piece, I kind of like the idea of like a museum of disgorged algorithms. I think to me, that seems like one, awesome, but also I think great guidelines for companies. It's like, here are the examples of those that have been destroyed, learn from it in the same way that we should learn from the Stasi. I mean, you can engage in that. I think on the preservation piece, and this gets to another conversation I had earlier, is I think a little bit about reparation and like how it is that we make the individual whole who've been harmed, say, by these algorithmic systems. And that's where I think disgorgement doesn't get us there yet with sort of repairing the individual. But I think a little bit about that. To the point about Facebook, Chair Chopra, who's now chair of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, in the Order Forever album expressly said we should have pursued algorithmic disgorgement against Facebook in that particular case. And that was in his press release with respect to the Order and Ever album. They should have done that. So I think in the Facebook example, it was a point of discussion. But I think another question we're considering is like, is there a point where you're too big to disgorge? We'd probably take the position no, but I'm sure other folks might not. And then the sort of last piece, as you sort of mentioned, the other agencies, and we're still sort of thinking about this, is like, what does algorithmic disgorgement look like outside of the FTC, right? Like the FTC has particular, authority, particular limitations, like they have very particular focus, but there are lots of other forms of algorithmic harm that the FTC cannot and will not ever touch because they can't. But things I think about would be like, if we're enforcing the Americans with Disabilities Act, like how could the DOJ like disgorge a discriminatory algorithm or engage in other contexts? So that's something I think we're still hoping to stew on and work on the paper, is where does algorithmic disgorgement sit with other agencies? Because disgorgement as sort of a remedy is available across. And I think those agencies are also thinking about bad AI, bad models, and trying to come up with ways to sort of shift incentives. And I also really like the point about exit. I think that's something I want us to consider more expressly in the paper in dialogue with that one, is the folks who are impacted when these are inevitably disgorged.
And then to hit on 2 points that you also mentioned, the fact that it incentivizes and basically requires data provenance in a more meaningful way than we currently have is one of the most exciting parts of it to me personally. Like I think that is like a definite point. And the too big to disgorge situation, like that's just sort of the cost of doing business if you're doing it irresponsibly. And so I think that there has to be just that responsibility, there has to be that threat, and that it's a good sort of stick if we're unable to legislate that effectively or politically feasibly. And the other thing about, Kurbo was a weird thing because it was its own company, did this stuff that was illegal through COPPA. In between getting the enforcement action, it got bought by Weight Watchers. And so I think Weight Watchers will probably have like, I don't know, Weight Watchers kids or whatever. But it's not like Kurbo anymore. So that EverAlbum is out of business, but the other Kurbo lives on in Weight Watchers, or WW. Yeah.
Great, thank you guys.
Yes, a really interesting paper. I learned a lot. 3 quick points. The first is you might want to tighten up your definition of algorithmic disgorgement. You have it as data, any data created or shaped by illegal means, right? So that's going to include lots of stuff that I think you don't even want to talk about, right? Data is created in all kinds of illegal activities. Second point, you're calling for, in many cases, destruction of data, and that's going to collide with a variety of legal doctrines. So both at the federal and state level, there are destruction of evidence statutes, evidence tampering statutes, the general federal obstruction of justice statute. There are discovery obligations to preserve evidence. In several states, there is a tort of spoliation of evidence. So something has to be done about that. It seems to me that you might want to think, not a museum, but you might want to think about sort of a process of placing the kind of data, the disgorged data or algorithms into escrow, so to speak, right? Into a legal status where someone has responsibility for managing the data. This is going to be very complicated. It might be akin to a receivership in equity because in many cases, it's not the data or systems are not going to be easily portable to, sort of another physical system that would maintain them. And then a final idea, also from the law of equity, is the idea equity has to deal in other kinds of disgorgement cases with problems of tracing, right? That's a big part of the logistical side of this problem, that lawfully collected data is mixed with illegally created data, and there are tracing problems. Equity has developed a whole series of ideas that might be adaptable to this context about what we do. You're talking about sort of contaminated data or a contaminated algorithm. And so just in general, abstracting from all of that, you're dealing with problems with a legal category that comes from equity. And so you might want to think about saying a little bit more about the law of equity and equitable remedies. It was really a great paper, a fun paper. Thank you.
Thanks. On I think that I definitely hear this whole like preservation for either legal purposes, and there has to be some way to figure out logistically how you can like sort of extract the disgorged data, and so insofar to be able to prevent further profit from it, which is the whole point of the disgorgement, or further use of it, you know, while not literally deleting it forever. So yeah.
I'll be brief. Just thank you for those comments, specifically around sort of receivership and escrow is I think the biggest part of what we're going to do next, both in this paper or follow up, is like the how we do this is sort of like the more of the logistical steps and other sort of tools, because that's sort of the question is a lot of folks are like, we buy it, but like how do we put this into practice? And I'm really excited to dive into some of those legal tools. I did not think I was going to hear escrow today, so thank you.
And we don't know if anyone knows how to do this. Yeah.
Hi, Tarek, student here and intern at Future Privacy Forum. I have to say this topic has been very fascinating to me. I don't think I've ever would have gotten so excited about such an obscure word. So one thing I think that would be interesting to kind of explore and unbox, especially as you talk about what this could actually look like, is the fact that there's a pretty wide spectrum within disgorgement of what could be done. If there's a specific subset of data that isn't properly collected, it may, like there is definitely the potential of taking down the entire business model and having it go into the Museum of Lifestyles of the Disgorgent Infamous. But I had to put that in somewhere. But there's like, say, for example, like maybe a set of biometric data that is problematic, and you just need to remove that from the algorithm. I think there's also some really interesting work to be done on the literature around like machine retraining and stuff like that. If you want a little bit of interesting kind of hybrid or interdisciplinary approach, I'm happy to talk about that like after as well. But I think just the fact that there is a lot of, like the stick is very big, but you can hit it at different levels of intensity, I guess, is I think a very interesting point to expand on.
Thank you. Yeah.
I really loved both of these papers, actually. Woody Hartzog, Boston University. I had a couple of questions or maybe recommendations, depending on how you interpret it. And then one question about the sort of central claim of the paper for the disgorgement paper. And then Laurel, I also had a question about your paper. But first, so I don't know if y'all saw recently, but one of the employees of a major tech company was, I think, under deposition. They were asking him like where all the data goes, and he was like, I don't know. I mean, it's somewhere, you know, vaguely sort of gesturing to the server barns or whatever. And we've had data mapping as a legal requirement for quite some time, right? So if we're this far along in the game just for data mapping, do we have any confidence? And I'm a fan of algorithmic disgorgement and destruction. I love this sort of initiative. Do we have any confidence at all that we'd be able to really actually back it up with it? And so you put this in the paper where you're like, how do we enforce? What about, you know, some of these other things? My team at Northeastern University, I work with a group of computer scientists there, and all this past semester we've had meetings and we've gotten together and talked about algorithmic disgorgements. And a lot of the computer scientists said, this is actually going to be, you know, either A, trivially easy for us to do depending on the scope, and we're just going to keep trucking. And so, you know, tech companies are going to say, oh no, you know, I got to delete an algorithm. Okay, fine. Right. And then they'll move on. Or it'll be practically impossible. And so I look forward to seeing how you map that one out. I also encourage you to build out the part about evasion strategies, particularly when we talk about using groups like systems and groups of algorithms that are off the shelf. If it's easy for them to use off the shelf, then I question the efficacy of a deletion requirements. And then this actually goes to the core part of your paper. So in the paper, you express a lot of enthusiasm for algorithmic destruction, which of course they also share. But then you start talking about how if we're going to do this, we need to embolden it with statutes and explicit rulemaking and all of this stuff. And at that point, I started to think, wait a second, if we're in the world where I get to craft a statute at all, is algorithmic destruction the best tool that we want, right? So in other words, if I just get to, pronounce, here's what we're going to do, is it the best? And what I would really love to see in the paper is actually you wrestling with that question, because as I see algorithmic destruction, it's the best of what we got, right? Like the FTC is doing what they can with what they got, and whew, it's not a ton, but it's something. And we've been trucking along at it for a certain amount of time. But what I would love to see is if we have our pen and we can write whatever law we want, how does this sort of match with a super aggressive data deletion requirement? What about straight up financial disgorgement, right? If we're writing statutes, let's just say, an overly generous interpretation of what it constitutes financial gains in any sort of wrongful activity. What about prohibiting business models outright? Like, is it better than that? Would it eat up space for that? What about a 3 strikes and you're out rule? No more biometric information for you, right? For certain kinds of data. One of the things that could really hurt, that would be a strong incentive, is let's just start stripping trade secret protection from all of these algorithms, right? Like, okay, you know, not only do you have to destroy it, you have to create a little repository or escrow, and you don't get trade secret protection for that anymore, right? For the whole sort of category. So I would love a comparative look as to where algorithmic destruction stacks among all of that, if we're in statute writing land. And then the final area is about FERPA, the FERPA problem, which is if it's too hard to enforce, are we ever going to do it, right? It'll happen once in a blue moon. And so are there any halfway steps? And then Laurel, I really loved reading about the paper, and I think this is something that is a long overdue intervention in the land of robotics. And my question to you is there a policy or law, like how do we sort of make this happen? And not just encourage people to do it, but like, how do we build this in? And I'll just throw out that Paul Ohm just wrote a really interesting paper about kill switches for IoT devices. That could be a way of thinking about, you know, when these devices in their natural life, how do we create rules that mandate design choices that will allow us to, you know, use certain things? Or is it a duty of care, or do we sort of sandwich this into privacy by design? So I would just love any reflection on, if we were going to make this happen, you know, how might we do it for both? Sorry.
Thanks, Woody. Laurel, do you want to take a chance to respond to that?
Oh, sure. I can try to give it a go. Yeah, I really like that question. And I actually remembered, Woody, I can't see you, by the way, so if you're nodding, I won't know, but I'll assume you are. We were in this NSF workshop together, and I remember in a small group, and I remember you bringing up the kill switches, and I think that's really interesting work and a really nice connection point that we were thinking about when we wrote this. Yeah, I mean, I think it'd be very nice to have laws, and it would be nice to have enforced laws on this. You know, I know in healthcare, we have like best practices about this, and you know, I think that there's sort of, it's very much clinically driven, but I wouldn't say that we had a very specific set of rules that guide us into how we should be ending interventions. It's more like things that we kind of do. But there, especially, of course, I think that it would be very nice to see that, and maybe there's maybe there's sort of health policy folks that could help to guide us there, and maybe there's some really nice analog we could consider in the tech policy space that would be could be useful there. You know, and I think it would be nice to have both though too. I think as you know, as our field matures, a lot of people, I think, are really starting to think about the implications of their technology. And I think someone mentioned this earlier, that when they started in tech, they didn't look at STS and these other topics, and now they're really recognizing the importance of this. And I think that a lot of individuals in the tech side of things are very much centering their work on this. We're adapting our undergraduate curricula to include more of this. So I'm very hopeful that in the future we'll have a new generation of individuals that are mindful of this as they create tech, and mindful of these broader implications as well.
Yeah, sure. So thank you for your comments. I agree with pretty much everything you said. On the, like, okay, if we're legislating with a magic wand, is algorithmic disgorgement the answer? I think no. I think in the paper, we talk about two different ways with enshrining it in some sort of legislation or rulemaking. One is which, like, we need to define unfair and deceptive trade practices and various practices that are illegal, similarly to the fact that like certain data collection is illegal under COPPA, in order to open up the universe of potential remedies, of which algorithmic disgorgement would be one. But I think it was more getting at the part you wrote about enshrining it specifically in.
Thank you, Woody, for your questions. Like Ben, I do unfortunately agree with most of the things you say all the time. I think you ask, I think a question that stumped me a little bit, but I think where I struggle with that question is we're working in this environment with like a limited FTC where this is the best we have, but we're also trying to think about like, what might this look like beyond the FTC and sort of think more creatively. But I mean, I'm always happy to write down what my magic wand might want. But I think that's gonna be an important part of the paper is how we think about, like, many of us celebrated this because I think there aren't a lot of things we get to celebrate with the FTC all the time, but as of late, we've got a lot more. Yeah, given us a lot of things.
Yeah, I think though we can all agree though, when the magic wand statute gets written, there's still a museum, right? Of
Yeah.
discordant algorithms. Okay, just as long as that's still here.
Hi, I'm Nicholson Price from Michigan. I'm sorry I haven't said that any of the other times. I want to suggest a couple things from the world of health. For Lorelei, for your paper, I don't know if cybernetics and like cyborgs count as robots, probably not. But there was a recent story that just struck me as an example that's right on point here about ocular implants that have given sight to people who were otherwise fully or mostly blind. And then the companies stopped supporting the particular models and or went out of business. And so they became blind again. So that feels like potentially a useful example, even if it's not right on point, it feels so good. I mean, bad that it might be worth mentioning. On the disgorgement point, I would both encourage you and discourage you from thinking about the health space rather than just the consumer space. I would discourage you because it gets complicated and different. I would encourage you for the same reason. I mean, because, right, you say like data acquired illegally, which is capacious and contestable and challenging. In the health space, right, there are these requirements for informed consent for secondary use of data in many instances, unless it's fully anonymized. And if it is anonymized, it's rather hard to pull it back out. And if it's informed consent, then you can withdraw it in the future. And so questions of like, what happens when you've been using this algorithm for a while, and then somebody says, just kidding, I want you to take my data back out. And then also, if that's an algorithm that people are relying on for patient care, it's no longer just here's a product I can't use anymore. It's this is the thing that's driving my medication. So it gets complicated and nasty, and I think it might be interesting, or it might just be the thing that you put in a footnote and say, by the way, it's all weird in health. Like, we're not going to talk about that. If you do want to talk about it, one place that you might consider looking is Michael Frumkin's 2019 paper, Big Data Destroyer of Informed Consent, which at least touches on some of these issues. I really enjoyed both of these projects, by the way.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tiffany Georgieski. I work at a law firm doing technology and privacy law. So thank you, everyone, for your papers. One disagreement and then two comments for the next series of the paper. So one on the point about data minimization, I kind of want to push back on the fact that that could reduce the number of algorithmic disgorgement remedies in the future. Because in my mind, if you only collected, let's say, my facial geometry or my fingerprint for a specific limited purpose, but then you used it for another purpose, you know, I only have one fingerprint, I can't get that back. So even if the collection was legitimate and limited, it doesn't change the fact that that's a unique piece to me that I cannot unwind, and rather focus on whether or not the data that was collected for a legitimate purpose was then used for an illegitimate purpose. So I don't know that data minimization is really going to cure that if there was additional information that was collected at the time that wasn't necessarily needed. Two pieces that I would love to see further elaborated on is you talk about, you know, the tracing issue that I think everyone's already discussed. I could have just said what he said, you know, but you mentioned that it shouldn't be a safe harbor, but you don't really go in like, I agree, it shouldn't, but what's to stop me, right? Because this happens after the fact. that they're getting hit with this, algorithmic disgorgement. What's to say that I just say, oh, did it touch this algorithm? Probably not. I didn't really track what went into it. It probably didn't. And they get to actually still keep the fruits of their labor, the fruits of the poison tree, because there's no way to prove that the data actually went into it. So could this actually encourage a lack of data mapping on certain algorithms? So that way, if they ever got hit with it, they're like, well, to our knowledge, it didn't really get assumed there. But something that you said that really struck me in terms of the convenience, right? Like, could there be alternatives and in terms of like either retraining, which was brought up, or maybe an opportunity to opt in, like in a class action, like, well, you can choose to have this deleted, or you can opt in and keep your data in that training model. And I say that as someone who relies on my targeted ads to tell me what to buy my husband every birthday. So like, I would want that. And could that be an incentive to actually have good data tracing, right? So that way you don't have to delete the entirety of what you've built. And the second piece that I'd love to see really fleshed out more as well is kind of what happens to the whole ecosystem? So in Everalbum and Kurbo, like they were also the ones data collecting, but we've also talked about algorithms off the shelf that could, be from, ill-gotten data. So in those situations, there's two ways it could go, right? Let's say a large company buys algorithm, or just as we've done with data sets, but those are easier to delete, from a small company with shallow pockets. They're just going to go bankrupt. But now you have all these other multinationals that have those kind of algorithms that are trained on bad data. Can you go to them and say, well, now all your customers also have to delete their products that are built on that? Or would that end up being a shield, right? Well, instead of us collecting it, let's get a little shell company. That way they get hit and we don't have to do anything. Or would it work the opposite way? Would big companies now say, I'm going to go direct to the consumer and get consent from them? How does that affect the whole data broker algorithm, startups, the whole ecosystem? I think would be interesting. And something it reminds me of is an ongoing class action against IBM for the Diversity in Faces case, which is the biometrics in Illinois saying like, use my face. And Microsoft recently came out in its position saying it's impossible for us to have gotten consent, right? Can that be a shield to whether or not they've used the data to that? So yeah, I think the whole ecosystem, I think, would be something that, at least from the business community, would be nice to kind of get your thoughts on.
Thank you. Those are super, super helpful points. And I didn't think of like flow down algorithmic disgorgement in the same way that we think of like data subject rights and how we have to flow through sort of the pipeline of service providers. So thank you for each of these points. And I think we're going to want to talk to you after this. That's okay.
Hi, Bhargavi Ganesh from University of Edinburgh. I really liked both papers a lot. I thought they were very important, and bans are something I've been thinking about a lot, but not disgorgement yet. So thank you for giving me that to think about. So my question is about, so a lot of the practical challenges have already been outlined, and I was going to bring them up about how, but I want to sort of offer an anecdote, more so from thinking about UK GDPR and whether you see any similarities there with the right to erasure that the ICO says that you have. So essentially, I had a conversation with the data scientist, and he said, well, if they wanted us to delete the data, that's fine, but then we'd have to retrain the model. And as someone who was working at a research organization, not a big company, it's expensive to retrain an entire model, especially if it's for research purposes, for the purposes of healthcare in this case, which was, something that an area of interest for the government. So I'm curious to know if that's something you've thought about at all as a potential parallel in some ways, at least from the logistical challenge standpoint. And then another point, I guess, about just like the end of life. I was thinking about the healthcare example mentioned earlier, and also I was reading about this insulin pump example. I'm not sure if others have seen it, of where it changed. There was a woman complaining about post-market surveillance and how it not served her because it changed. They changed the provider of the insulin pumps, and then, or it was like a device inside of her, and then she was in a lot of pain. So that's something that just wanted to add. Thanks.
I think just briefly, thank you for your comment and your suggestions. I think that I'm having trouble sort of ideating with the individual rights of like right to erasure or right to opt in or opt out when this is coming to something that affects you. And I think that it is really interesting. I think that logistically it has the same challenges that disgorgement would have. And I think that's it sort of gets to the point where with algorithmic harm, sometimes you don't necessarily have concrete evidence or knowledge that you are part of that data set. And I think that in the examples of a situation with targeted advertising or something to that effect, it's not like that is a product that you are buying and putting into, it'll just replenish with a different ad network. And so like, it's not like it would break things, I don't think, like products. We can figure out ways that it would, but I don't see that as like a major problem, but I think we'll think through that a lot.
Hi, Kristen from Canada. I just have a really like simple question, maybe, or short question at least, purely from a place of curiosity, and pardon if it's just my ignorance of how these things work. But I'm curious if there's a transnational dimension to all of this, or if there are any transnational barriers, and maybe said a better way, like the transnational nature of data collection and algorithm training. Does that play into this in a way? I guess where I'm coming at is like Clearview. I'm thinking of Clearview, and the privacy commissioner in Canada said Canadians' data was illegally collected. But like, what does that mean in the US, and or if there's like an order here for disgorgement, but it affects, use across other countries? What does that mean?
What does that mean? But I think that's like a massive gap that I totally didn't think about. I mean, we spend as privacy professionals a lot of time thinking about international data transfers, how it is we think about like this data is living in a variety of places, but I think I have not thought about that.
Also, like, could a bunch of Canadians come to the FTC and get like disgorgement? I don't know. Okay. Yeah.
They'll take the comments in the program. Yeah. Yeah, I think that it makes like the logistical nightmare even more, a little bit more of a nightmare. But I do think that it's similar to like other privacy laws where depending on where the enforcement occurs, the effect will be felt transnationally. And so if we are going to be good, if the US is going to be good at doing the enforcement, it will benefit individuals that have been illegally sort of had data collected about them elsewhere. But I do think that it's an interesting logistical challenge we should address.
And I think on that as well, like consumer protection authorities specifically, like they do work in harmony, they do talk to each other, they do sort of engage, like kind of curious about sort of like an international ring of consumer protection authorities, like disgorging across the world. But I mean, maybe that's part of sort of the practical implementation is like, if we have other countries pursuing algorithmic disgorgement, how do we perfect methods and otherwise feel like enforce, say, a particular consent decree?
Which we're seeing with like GDPR enforcement, right? Like it's up to individual country DPAs, and it's become a nightmare where there's all sorts of weird incentives and it's become a mess. So yeah, that is to say, thank you for the comment.
I wanted to briefly respond to Barb's comment and Nicholson's comment. Thank you so much for those, because I think those are really, really great examples and something that we were talking a lot about actually, because this does happen a lot in the medical device industry. There is a market exit, or in the case that Barb just mentioned of sort of this data continuing to be collected, like post the system being on the market any longer. And these are really interesting questions. And one of the things that it seems like that we need to think a lot about is how to let users be part of this process and be more aware of this process. Because I think that's probably one of the biggest problems is that there's such an asymmetry of the people who need this treatment where they don't really have an option or a choice. And the onus on these organizations to continue to support them and maintain them. And whether they have a viable alternative to use something else, and whether it's going to be invasive or expensive to use this other item. So for example, in the ocular implant sense, I would imagine that's a fairly invasive surgery, and to sort of replace that with some other system in the future could be quite problematic. I'm sure when you've adapted to it and it's altered your vision and so on. So it raises a lot of really challenging issues that I think we really need to be thinking a lot more about.
I have one question for each, and forgive me if this is like discussed in the paper and I've only skimmed. So for the disgorgement sort of stuff, what about sort of algorithms, models, and data that are released to the public or open source, where like the cat's kind of out of the bag? Like, for example, there's Tiny Images has been, you know, retracted and deleted by MIT, but it's still easy to get. ImageNet had faces blurred, but it's probably still easy to get the unblurred version. And maybe like some of those, like Hugging Face released Bloom, and there's this Stable Diffusion like text to image model, and that might have been trained on copyrighted material. I don't know if this like all relates, but just some things that might be worth thinking about. I'm a computer scientist, so I have no, I don't have the law information. And then for the robot stuff, if you haven't already considered, what about like some of the other areas where like end of life might have a useful model that's already existing? You know, some companies help you with computers when you're done with it. Maybe expensive manufacturing hardware in factories. Farmers can continue to use tractors that are like 50 years old or more and like modify them and make it work for them. And even if they're like a half century old, and you know, those might be some concepts worth thinking about. I don't know, and wanted to see what you thought.
I haven't thought about the open source thing. I really appreciate that comment and want to think more about that.
I'd just add, I don't think the cat's out of the bag. I think all the more reason to pursue algorithmic disgorgement, and the fact that these are made public might actually help regulators trace who might be leveraging them and sort of the problems with it. So I think it's all the more reason to continue.
Laurel?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think that's something that, you know, we've been thinking a lot about. So in the disability community, there's a really strong notion of disabled individuals hacking systems themselves to make them usable and to sustain them over time, particularly when they are no longer functioning or no longer working in the way that they want. And you know, this is often glossed over, but is a big part of the disability rights movement of disabled creators and hackers and so on. And so, you know, what's important is thinking about ways to facilitate that among users of robots. And so I think we talk a little bit in the paper and sort of like how, you know, there used to be this notion that you could like fix your own shoes or fix your own car or these things, but they've reached this level of complexity where that's no longer feasible. And so I think it's worth thinking about how to support that. And you know, the maker movement's had a renaissance in the past 10 years or so, and that's been great. But I think we need to continue to imagine this. Part of the challenge is that our systems, even our simple, you know, systems that we think are straightforward are becoming increasingly complex. You know, your microwave, your dishwasher, your car, your remote control are becoming increasingly complicated to use. And there's not really a good reason for that other than future creep. But I think that ultimately it's important to think about sustainment, particularly now that people don't want to be buying a new thing every 5 minutes anymore from an ecological perspective and a financial perspective. So I think this is a really good opportunity for us to start to envision ways that we can enable people to themselves possibly learn to adapt and maintain technologies that they already have.
Hey, I'm Tanush. I'm an undergrad at the Allen School here at UW. I guess I had two questions or comments, I guess. The first one is that, or I guess first off, like, thank you for the paper. It was great to read. I'd never heard of algorithmic disgorgement before today. So it seems like a really cool concept. But I guess my question first off is that if algorithmic disgorgement is able to, let's say, force a company to get rid of the data and the models they've trained, what do you do about sort of like the know-how they've gathered when it came to sort of like developing that? And I guess, for example, in the conclusion of the paper, you talked about, I don't know how to pronounce it, Securus, and the commercial voice recognition products they develop using incarcerated voice recognition. So once they have already developed this product, if the FTC comes in and forces them to get rid of that model, what if their engineers already kind of got that experience of, you know, this is the data that's really helpful, this is how we can fine tune it, what's stopping them from going to another data source and getting that data. And I guess even worse, if let's say the US regulates it really well with the FTC, what's stopping them from going to another country, perhaps with a less powerful regulatory regime and getting the data from people over there? And even if, they get people in other countries to consent, what if they take advantage of maybe a different financial situation and stuff like that, I guess. So, maybe that might not pose legal questions, but it may pose ethical questions when it comes to the sourcing of the data. And I guess that kind of leads me to my second question, which is the examples you gave were mostly the FTC enforcing different companies. And I wonder what would happen if they tried to use this against another government organization. Because if you look at like the, there's like lots of illegal data collection that happens by like the NSA or other government entities. And I wonder, especially given the politics of it all, if it would be possible to enforce algorithmic disgorgement on government entities, or if they would kind of be immune.
Thank you so much for both of those questions. On the second question, unfortunately, like the laws just don't apply to them. Like the FTC's like purview is consumer, and so it's commercial activity pretty much exclusively. And the same goes for CFPB and stuff like that. I do think that like if the government has the appetite to do regulation well, they should also be looking inwards, and I think should be doing that first. And some people are starting to, or trying to start to maybe. And on the first question about the know-how, I think that's a really interesting idea about the less tangible sort of gains that they have gotten throughout their process. But I do think that in response to the idea of okay, so Securus developed a voice recognition algorithm through compulsory use. If anybody wants to talk to their lawyer or family member or whatever in prison, they're building an algorithm off of prisoners' data. And so that, in my opinion, is a really clear example of why something that should be legal and then used. And if they were to go back and do it with a different data set, nothing's necessarily stopping them from doing that, but I do think that there are like different sort of market incentives where they'd either have to pay people to do that or figure out ways that are going to be maybe a little bit less effective, a little bit less intrusive, and it would just like create some sort of barrier. But it's not necessarily, it's not going to like legislate out harmful business like concepts, I think, unfortunately. But thank you.
I would also just add to your sort of second point around like how can we disgorge the NSA? I think that gets to sort of Woody's point around if we were to think about this and step back beyond just the limitations of say FTC authority in the current environment, like how could we disgorge the NSA? How does that stand as like a, an individual data right with respect to like government collection of, data? So I think that'll be a part of the consideration if we do more of the, like, what are like beyond the, if this is not the best in its present form, what could be like the ideal version of it? And I think this goes to other questions as well, as I think like algorithmic disgorgement is not the perfect tool. It's a tool that arises in a very limited framework of data protection, among other things in the US and elsewhere. So I think for us, like we're excited by it, but we can't expect it to solve all of the woes of AI and data. I think for us, it's exciting because it's a great step among a lot of not steps. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I'm Maria Angel, a PhD candidate here at the University of Washington School of Law. So my question is for Jevan and Ben. This is also a new term for me, but as I understand it, it happens usually when we are in front of algorithms that have been developed or shaped or created based on ill-sourced data. So it seems to me that it applies only when the privacy harm has already occurred. So you have the privacy harm, then they use this data to develop an algorithm, and then you can apply this type of right or remedy. But I was wondering if you have thought about the possibility of suggesting it for cases when actually there is a harm. I would not call it a privacy harm. Some scholars call it a privacy harm, but an data-driven harm that comes afterwards or stems from the use of the algorithm. And I'm referring to things such as discrimination or manipulation. What happens if one of those harms, you can see that harm? Is it possible for the subject to use this right or this remedy and ask for the company to destroy the algorithm because that algorithm was used and derived on this harm? Thank you.
I think that's something that we're still hoping to develop in the paper as we think about algorithmic disgorgement as a form of as a right, as an individual right. If an individual has been subject to, say, discriminatory machine learning system, right, do they then have the right to destroy it? But I think that's something we're planning to unpack in sort of the still to be drafted parts of the paper about what might a right to algorithmic disgorgement look like. Like practically speaking, that becomes quite hard, but also like I'm not here to discuss practicality. Yeah, I think that's something we'll unpack in the paper.
And on the point of we're doing it at the point of privacy harms, I think that is one element of it, but not necessarily the only universe in which it's relevant. Like, so if you take the Clearview example, another one, which I think is a pretty good candidate for this type of intervention, it is both the privacy harm in and of itself to have that data scraped against your, terms of service, whatever, in addition to other endless harms, but it's also the harm that you get when there is a police or otherwise intervention that would not have otherwise happened without the use of a Clearview algorithm at like a basketball game or whatever. And so I do think that there is the data-driven harm that this remedy would address still, like beyond the privacy harm. And it's more about, so it's interesting to think about what sort of harms it addresses, and if there's a situation where it's not privacy harm plus or privacy harm by itself, but just the plus. I don't know. Yeah. Thank you.
You refer.
Okay, this is me, Mona Son at NeTubing in NYU. This might fall totally out of your frame. If it does, feel free to ignore me. What about the ideas that underpin model development and data collection? So I'm going to give you an example. I do quite a bit of research on the use of algorithmic systems in recruiting. And one of the things, or one of the products that's very often used is not actually, the higher view facial recognition or facial interpretation software, but a personality type detection AI based on text. We did a bit of research on that, we audited that and all of that, but we can kind of stamp out that algorithm or the data collection that is tied to that, but the idea will still float around, and it still kind of has become at least a little bit integral to the professional practice of recruiting. So I wonder, if we talk about algorithmic disgorgement, is that something we can also talk about kind of socially? Like, what is there something around, outing things as pseudoscience or something like that we need to think alongside that?
Thank you for your question. I could never ignore you. And that's totally not out of scope at all. I think a fascinating question. First, I'm going to plug Luke Stark and my paper on physiognomic artificial intelligence, but I think there's a connection in how this happens, right? Like in that, we'd argue that lawmakers of the FTC need to label these practices as like per se unfair and deceptive, right? That like in and of themselves, scanning people's faces and making determinations about their internal characteristics should just be fundamentally off limits. If Congress can legislate saying like, this is unfair and deceptive per se, or the FTC can attempt to put a policy statement out without being challenged, right? Then instead of having to go through the investigation of say improving like unfairness and deception, it's like, look, there's a rule on the books. If you're using it, we can both go after you, disgorge it. And I think that's part of this is like, I would love to see disgorgement used against pseudoscientific AI. I think these are forms of AI that are fundamentally unfair and deceptive that are just not worthy of the FTC's time to actually dive into the investigation. Like these should be categorically rejected. And I think you need lawmakers to say that, and then you have a tool to then effectuate it. But that's like, if I could disgorge anything first, those are some of the systems that I'm really interested in getting disgorged. But I think it requires coordination from lawmakers to say explicitly that these systems are worthy of contempt, should be banned. And then when they're banned, you can use disgorgement as enforcing your ban. Like, hey, we said it's unfair and deceptive, like XYZ company are scanning people's faces and making determinations about whether they're going to be good employees. Like, no. So you need per se things. And I myself, Ben, and other folks have argued that, like we need per se unfair and deceptive practices that will make this far more efficient. Thank you for your question.
Yeah, I can make it quick. So I just wanted to jump in and say first, thank you all for your papers. This is fantastic to read them both. For Laurel, one issue that has come up before, specifically in the automated driving space, is the question of if a company were to go bankrupt and had sold a consumer product that involved this very expensive system and now no longer can maintain it, it is no longer useful, should they be required to have an insurance policy to compensate the consumer who spent all this money on this product that now no longer works for them? It's come up. Brian Walker Smith raised it in the Uniform Law Commission context. It hasn't made it into law anywhere, but it's an idea that has been floated that I thought was interesting in the context of your paper. And then on the question of disgorgement, I would encourage you both to lean into playing defense very strongly and to think about explaining the harms that are justified by a disgorgement remedy and sort of clearly articulating that and making that very clear as why this is an important tool to maintain in the toolkit going forward.
Let's do one last.
Yeah, please, okay.
One last.
No, we got it. If it's Margot.
No, Margot except. Briefly, your writing is hilarious. I loved the disgorgement paper. I'm just like, please keep writing that way.
Wait, who
and-
read Tyra Banks's 1998 memoir to find the quote? Who was it?
Oh, I have to check it. I love it so much. So, but I was going to say substantively, I think you have an opportunity to talk about group harms and social harms and not just talk about it through the lens of individual harms. And so when you're going through your substantive things that you would put into a law, I think your opportunity is to talk about things on a society-wide or group level.
Thank you, and that compliments an honor coming from me, so thank you.
Yeah.
And agreed.
But you always hear from Margot if you can. That's the lesson. Okay, well, thank you so much. This was fascinating. Thanks, Laurel, for setting yourself up to come by Robot, and thanks so much for the discussion. Meg, I really appreciate it. Please join me in thanking this final panel. Oh my goodness. All right, well, that actually concludes our conference. I have a couple of announcements. Don't get up. Almost concludes it. I have a couple quick announcements. I think you're going to want to hear these. I'll be very brief. I know you all have been very patient and want to explore the city or go back home or whatever it is you're doing. First thing, just another thank you to our sponsors, our program committee, and to the staff. I've heard again and again and again from you how wonderful the staff has been, how responsive our staff and students have been. So, and that's Alex and Anna and Andrew and Maria and Nicholas, Shot and Jack, and truly an incredible job. Then we actually have a tradition at We Robot that the program committee will select a couple of papers that really stood out to us as being best papers. And in fact, there is some funding behind it in honor of Ian Kerr. And so we'll be following up with these authors about the recognition that they're getting and also the funding. And I just wanted to announce what those papers were. The first was Daniel Hinkle, Tales from the Sausage Factory. Congratulations. And the second from the very same panel actually was Bhargavi Ganesh and Stuart Anderson and Sharon Barrett. So the Kindle paper, so congratulations. I wanted to just reiterate that for those of you who are looking for something to do, that it's actually also very close to a lot of great Seattle restaurants and bars. I cannot recommend Franny Choi's book on reading enough, and it's going to be at Ada's Technical Books, which is a beautiful bookstore that only sells technical and science fiction books, and it's an absolutely beautiful space in Capitol Hill, 425 15th Ave East. She won the Elgin Award for Best Poetry in Science Fiction. She's a slam poet champion, and she has a forthcoming collection of essays on race, robots, and feminism. And this particular book is about poetry about cyborg entities. We talked about Donna Haraway when we talked last night. I mean, just really, really interesting. And then the last thing is typically we will announce where the next We Robot will be and the date. It's supposed to go back to Miami every other year. But this coming year, it won't be going back to Miami. It's not logistically going to be possible for them to host it. So we will be following up with an announcement about where the next one is, and we're in discussions with a couple of people. So anyway, with that, love you guys. Thank you.